And thanks, first of all, to Filippo and Caroline for organizing this and for inviting me. This paper is partly based on something that's already published, and then I have added certain things to it. And it's part of an interest of mine in thinking about radical politics today. So I'm interested in debates within radical democratic theory. And then I'm interested in forms of leftist or radical politics today, especially these kind of new forms of protest or activism like the Indignados or Occupy. And so I have been looking together with Marina Pantulis, I've been looking at the Indignados in Spain and in Greece, comparing them and looking at them. And first we were interested in what was going on when they were protesting in 2011, and now we are, of course, more interested in what is coming after that and how are these discourses of activism and so on, how are they being transformed when they are moving from the squares into political parties and engaging with unions and parties and institutions. And also, of course, what is happening, if anything, to those parties where they intervene. Anyway, so in this paper, I want to take the opportunity of this conference and use the metaphor of the monster or the monstrous or monstrosity to read debates within and about these Spanish Indignados. So these are these protests in Spain that started in Spain on the 15th of May 2011 and carried on for a few months over that summer. So I use this metaphor of the monster, the monstrous, in a loose sense to refer to something that's scary or dangerous for the political system, something that's usually managed or controlled by liberal institutions or by conservative tradition. And one name for this is the multitude, and it's expressed usually in the image of a sea of people in a square, for instance. And this is also a name that was prevalent among protesters and commentators in Spain, and often these protesters, the activists and also the commentators, would draw directly or indirectly on Harde Negri. Another name was the people. I'm going to come back to this pair of names or concepts of the multitude and the people. For now, I just want to note how the monstrosity of the Indignados, whether the multitude or the people, it both appeared as a threat and also at the same time as a source of power or potency. Right? And I think this is absolutely key. One more thing before I start in earnest, and that's representation. And I'd like to make two brief comments here. One is that whenever we talk about the Indignados as monstrous in whatever form, then we're dealing in representations. So in other words, their monstrosity, so to speak, is constituted at the level of representation. That's one comment. The second comment is this, that often the monstrosity, whether good or bad, of the Indignados and their power, often this is said to be a function of their non-representative character, of the non-representative forms of organization. And this is so whether we're dealing with the Indignados themselves or with their critics. It's the fact that they are said to have gone beyond representation. It's that gives them their power, their potency, the power of the monstrous. Although it's a bit more complex than this, and I'll try to come back to this in the paper. But the upshot of this for me is that we need to focus on the question of representation in the discourse of the Indignados and discourses about them. So I have to say something about representation and the limits of representation. Okay, so I'm going to say something now about representation and how that question of representation was dealt with in the discourse of the Indignados at the time. Now, the protest in Spain started on the 15th of May 2011, when on a Sunday night, when a few activists occupied, after a demonstration, they occupied the square which is called Puerta del Sol in the heart of Madrid. This occupation and camp quickly grew in the space of a few days, and it spread to other cities in Spain and also smaller towns. Now, a lot of the Spanish protest was against politics as usual, so to speak. So there was a critique of the political elites, to some extent also a critique of the mainstream media and the kind of economic, financial elites, especially the banks. There's a big issue there. And there was a critique of the political system more generally, the political system as unrepresentative, unresponsive, and so on. And beyond that, there was also a critique of traditional forms of, or conceptions of politics, let's say, of what form politics should take, of where it should take place, etc. Now, with these challenges to traditional conceptions of politics, the protesters opened up the possibility of rethinking a whole number of issues and also concepts and practices. And the most important of those concepts was that of representation, in the case of the Spanish Indignados at least. References to the incongruity of representational with direct or real democracy abounded. Representation was associated with political parties, sometimes also unions, and with the political system more broadly. And representation was associated with the view of citizenship as passive, where politicians make decisions and they speak to the people rather than with the people. So voice and equal voice thus became associated with the critique, if not rejection, of representation. In Spain, one of the iconic slogans of the Indignados was, "They don't represent us, no nos representan." So the claim there was that there was a failure of representation. We have got a vote, but we haven't got a voice. The politicians are unrepresentative because they don't act in accordance with the views and interests of the citizens, and also because the politicians form a distant elite with little in common with ordinary citizens, the ordinary citizens that they're supposed to represent. So there's a claim that there's a failure of representation as both delegation and as resemblance. But this critique of representation among the Indignados in the discourse was not unequivocal. You can try and place it along a continuum. If you do that, then you could say that the demands and the claims, they varied from changing the current representatives through demands for better and different forms of representation to the wholesale rejection of representation. Almost no one was satisfied merely to have new representatives, and the rejection of the political parties was a recurrent theme. Now, the question of representation took on a very immediate form or character in Spain because a week after the protest started, on the 22nd of May, there were local elections across Spain. So this immediately became an important and question that they had to address somehow. Now, the more widespread view was that the political representatives were not representative because of the structure of the electoral system. And I won't go into the details of that. And also because of the internal selection processes within the political parties, especially within the conservative PP and the social democratic PSOE, the two big parties. And from this critique, there emerged the demand for better representation, that is, more representative representatives, let's say, including representation of minority views and representatives who are more responsive to voters. Now then, in relation to the local elections on the 22nd of May, this demand led to different tactical positions. Okay, given this critique of representation, what do we do? And some voted for smaller parties in a snub of the PSOE duopoly, the two big parties. Others voted blank or void in order to protest against the poverty of the choice that they were facing, and still others abstained in order to protest the illegitimacy of the existing political system and electoral system. Now, all these tactics, in different ways, they played into the hands of the conservative PP. But it's important to know that the disaffection with PSOE, the Social Democrats, this is what really led many protesters into these voting tactics in the first place, because in their view, there was no longer any substantial difference between PSOE, the Social Democrats, and the conservative PP, the rest of the political class. There was this general feeling that PSOE, the Social Democrats, had let us down. And that's important to keep in mind here. Now, in the case of those who were abstaining in protest against the existing political system, it's not only pointless to vote, but it's suggested that voting in itself propagated existing forms of misrepresentation. And this in turn points to a wider and more radical critique of the representative system, namely the view that what makes political institutions, parties and unions, etc., unrepresentative, it's their hierarchical structure or nature. And there are two alternatives then here that emerge from this. The first is a different kind of representative institutions, more horizontal, more participatory, more direct democracy, where the voices of individuals and of the people have a real say, for instance through referenda. This sort of representation, it was argued, is better because the distance is shorter between the will of the people and the political decisions. So better representation is achieved through immediacy, or at least more immediacy. It's still a representational structure though, and these new forms of representation can either replace or supplement existing forms of representation. Now, while this first alternative aims at better representation, the second alternative was to identify representation itself as the problem here. As soon as there are representatives, this is the argument, representatives speaking for someone else, then the voices of the latter are silenced or distorted. Now in Madrid, those rejecting representation as such, they nonetheless concluded that representation, even if not desirable, at least it was unavoidable. So to take an example here, so there were guidelines for all sorts of things that were drawn up in the course of the camps and the protest. So there were guidelines, for instance, for setting up local assemblies in neighborhoods across Madrid. And there you find the view that individual participants can only speak for themselves, as it should be. But if they have to speak for others, then care has to be taken that you represent their views, the others' views, correctly. And so when representatives from the local assemblies take decisions and views of their assembly to the General Assembly in Puerta del Sol, they were instructed to represent the decisions and views of their assembly faithfully. And on top of that, there should be 2 representatives from each local assembly to ensure that a representative doesn't misrepresent the decisions and views of the local assembly. And similarly in the debates about the internal organization of the movement more broadly, here too the debates centered around the possibility and also the desirability of going beyond representation. Nonetheless, the movement and also its horizontality and the autonomy of the different parts of the movement, all this was organized in a way that didn't escape representation. So there were rules about behavior in the assemblies, when you can speak and so on, and how you speak. Rules about the relationship between different parts of the movement, different assemblies and working groups and assemblies, etc. And the activists, of course, represented themselves and the movement to themselves and also to the outside world when speaking in the name of the movement, when speaking as Indignados, for instance, or as 15M. So the Indignados, they remained caught within this question of representation. It didn't go away of how to represent rather than moving beyond it. And I'm going to come back to that. Now I'm going to shift a little bit and then I'll weave back and forth between different things here. So now I'm going to talk about hegemony and autonomy. And I'm going to be very schematic and crude here. But it's a kind of schema that probably needs a bit of deconstruction, but maybe we can come back to that afterwards. So one way to map debates within contemporary radical democratic theory and also debates among activists, it's an opposition between hegemony and autonomy. So this opposition or distinction is particularly useful for thinking about the political stakes of different ontologies, different political ontologies, and also for thinking about questions of political strategy, which is what I'm mostly interested in. So very briefly and schematically again, in the hegemony strand we find people like Laclau and Mouffe and Zizek, and of course here the main sources of inspiration are Gramsci and Lacan, and for Zizek also Lenin. Notwithstanding the important differences in their diagnosis of capitalism and the important differences in their views of political strategy, Laclau and Mouffe and Zizek, they nonetheless reject the autonomy approach because they believe that hegemony and representation are constitutive. And this is the point at which, when I was presenting an earlier version of this argument at the University of Westminster, Chantal Mouffe interrupted me and said, "No, you can't do that with Zizek. I cannot be in the same category as Zizek. It's impossible." But of course, my point here is not that they are the same. They are not. There are very important differences there between the kind of Laclau-Mouffe position on hegemony and then Zizek. My point is that this distinction between hegemony and autonomy is useful for thinking about other debates rather than those debates between Laclau and Zizek and Mouffe and Zizek. Right? So in the autonomy strand, we find Hardenegri and Paolo Vierno, these kind of people. And here the emphasis is on horizontal relations among autonomous singularities. And of course here the main philosophical source of influence is Deleuze, but also Marx in the case of Hardenegri at least. Now, so to illustrate this opposition between hegemony and autonomy, consider how the theorists analyze the square protests in Spain and elsewhere, and where they differ in their analysis. So take Laclau and Mouffe as an example. So Laclau and also Mouffe, Laclau has only made very few comments, brief comments on the square protest, and for him the main issue is how the ideas and the practices of the protest can become politically effective. That is a question for him, or was the question for him. And his answer was that the protests, they have to transform into a collective will that will then become an integral state in the Gramscian sense. So the movements, they have to organize and they have to develop a collective discourse, a collective identity that will then become institutionalized. And central to both Laclau and Mouffe is the construction of a collective identity around the figure of the people, as opposed to the multitude. Now, for those emphasizing the novelty of the square protests, what's quintessential in them is the way that these protests established horizontality and autonomy in a real way. So for Hardenegri, what's new about the Occupy movements is first of all their organizational form. They are horizontal, they are leaderless networks with no center, they are made up of autonomous individuals and groups, singularities, who cannot be represented by others, and who cannot claim to represent or speak for the movement as a whole. So they are an example of a constituent power in that they do not make demands to an already constituted power, the state, but instead they create new power, the democratic power of the multitude. And in this way they produce the common. So in this way they are also autonomous vis-à-vis the existing institutions. And what's new is both the form of the protests and what they demand, so to speak. Of course, demand here is not quite the right word. And so we need new categories in order to capture what they're doing, which is then what Hardenegri have been trying to develop over the last 10, 15 years. Now, two things divide the hegemony and autonomy strands when analyzing these square protests. One concerns the question of how to characterize what the protesters are doing. So for the autonomist, the autonomy theorists, it's something new that cannot be captured by old categories, and therefore we need to invent new categories using categories such as swarm intelligence from Deleuze and Guattari, etc. By affirming their unrepresentability, the protesters place themselves outside the political order, and any attempt to find expression in and to be accommodated within that order would automatically mean their abolition as a multitude. For the hegemony theorist, the protesters should engage in hegemony, And doing so opens up the possibility of a potential transformation of their politics into something that will engage, and in so doing also challenge, the existing political order. But the point here is that you have to engage with existing political institutions for people like Lasse and MOVE. And in doing so, the movements will have been institutionalized to some extent, but for them, this is what will help the radicalization of the democratic system. There's no other way. So what follows then is that a difference between hegemony and autonomy concerns the way that they see the success of the possible success of the square movements or protests. For the hegemony theorists, the protests have to take a hegemonic and representational form, and the protesters, they have to be conscious about this in order to be effective. For the autonomy theorists, they have to remain horizontal and remain autonomous vis-à-vis the existing political system, and also retain an autonomy structure, and they have to remain non-representational. For the hegemony theorists, the central figure of subjectivity here is the people, and for the autonomists, of course, it's the multitude, insofar as you can call that a subject. In some form it is. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this, but I want to now turn to how the potency or the lack of potency of the Indignados was represented. And after that, I'll come back to this distinction between hegemony and autonomy, and also the people multitude. So potency. And again, I'm going to be very schematic here and crude. In the representations of the Indignados movement, both representations by the activists themselves and by commentators, the movement is seen by some as impotent and by others as potent. And whatever the case, the impotence or the potency is due to the same thing, that the protesters, sought to eschew representation. Now, for those critics, whether they were sympathetic or not, those critics who saw the movement as impotent, it was precisely due to the fact that, one, the protesters, they didn't organize themselves in representational hierarchies, and secondly, that they didn't engage directly with existing representational institutions. This is the problem. So whatever they did, they would remain ineffectual. So this is the typical hegemony critique by Lasse and MOVE, among many others. Others saw the movement as a powerful threat to the existing political system. Now, for some, this was a problem given the legitimacy of the system, because if the political system and the political parties and the politicians, if they are really representative, then of course the Indignados could not be so. The Indignados, for these kind of critics, the Indignados were gathering there in the squares and speaking from sites, from places that were unrecognizable to these people as political. They were out of place somehow. For others, of course, this was the whole point, right? Namely, not to speak from an already constituted political institution or site. Anyway, so if you believe that the politicians have been elected through elections by the whole people, then they will, of course, express the will of the demos of the people. And then, if you follow that argument, whenever the Indignados spoke in the name of the people, then they were usurping this name, which was not rightfully theirs. For others, of course, the opposite was true. While not necessarily able to speak in the name of the people as a whole, if the people is a multitude, this is impossible. The kind of politics that was practiced by the Indignados was the only legitimate way to wield power. Indeed, only this kind of politics can be the expression of a constituent power of the multitude. So 2 lines of division here. First question is the movement potent or impotent? And beyond that, is the multitude a potent political subject? And then secondly, is the multitude of the Indignados, is that a legitimate political subject? But what happens if we assume that, if we start from the assumption that representation is constitutive? For instance, if there's no non-representational way of conceiving of and organizing the multitude of the Indignados. What happens then? Well, in that case, the first line of division takes on a different form. It's then no longer a question of representation or no representation, but instead of what forms of representation are most effective as political strategy for whatever goals you may have. Those forms of representation may range from a hierarchical avant-garde party in some contexts to horizontal networks in other contexts. And there may then be disputes over what form of representation is most effective and most just. The second line of division also takes on a different look. If representation is constitutive, we cannot oppose the multitude to the people simply, or indeed the multitude to the political system, at least not according to a distinction between representation and non-representation. Demos, the people, the multitude, these are all different figures, different representational figures. And direct democracy cannot be opposed to representational democracy as non-representational. Instead, we can think of these debates as different claims, different representative claims, in a hegemonic struggle over the constitution of a representational field. Now, of course, doing so places me squarely within the hegemony strand of contemporary radical democratic theory. And indeed, my claim would be that autonomy and horizontalism, horizontal relations, have to be understood as forms of hegemonic struggle. Indeed, as necessary and positive forms of hegemonic struggle. Then we can discuss exactly how we understand hegemony. That's another discussion. I now turn to my last section, which is about Podemos, which is the title of this section is Podemos, Yes We Can, Spanish Style. In the elections last month for the European Parliament, the one big surprise in Spain was how well the new party Podemos did. They got about 10% of the votes and 5 seats. They are a new party, they are only months old. They went kind of unnoticed by the mainstream media because they relied very heavily on social media, on internet TV channels, on YouTube videos and the like. They rely on assemblies like the ones that were developed during the Indignados protests. And many of the people who are active now in Podemos, they were active in Indignados and in other similar protests after that. Now Podemos, the party, is particularly interesting for me, for my purposes, because they combine a horizontal structure with a more typical party structure. But there's a combination of the two. On the one hand, they're clearly organized as a network of assemblies and individuals and circles. They also talk about circles. And they make use of these independent media and try to so there's an attempt at a kind of exodus from the system. On the other hand, they have also organized themselves as a party with the clear intention of gaining representation within and taking over the state. I mean, they say that this is what we need to do here, not everywhere, but here at this moment, at this election. One aside here, quick aside. You can think about, so we had the Indignados, and out of that have come different other protests, and some people have tried to move from the squares into parties. Now you can think about this as 3 roads from the squares. So one road is to go to Izquierda Unida, which was a party that existed already on the left, has existed for about 3 decades, which is a more traditional party. It has been dominated by the Communist Party in Spain. Another thing that emerged out of the Indignados was a party that also ran for election this time at the European election, which is called Party X, Partido X, which is a completely open network, and they didn't do very well. And then in the middle of those two, you have you have Podemos, And one way to think about these different options is to think of them as different kinds of steering systems for a computer. So Podemos is the Linux. Do you say Linux in English or Linux? Linux of steering systems. Right, so the existing parties, including Indignados, it's like Microsoft Office. Right? Here's your program, you take it or leave it. And if it doesn't fit your singularity, that's your problem. Right? The Partido X, the Party X, is kind of a completely open source program or steering system. You just do with it what you want, and it's completely open, no borders to what it is. But what Podemos did, and this is part of the explanation for their success, is they did it the kind of Linux way. Because on the one hand, you can take this party, Podemos, or the steering system, Linux, and you can do with it things, at least if you know a bit about how to program and so on, you can do with it what you want, and you can adjust it to your particular singularity or your particular individuality. But at the same time, it's something that is recognizable to a lot of people, and you could simply take Linux or Podemos, take it from the shelf and use it as it is. Now, Podemos is a kind of one-headed monster, or it's represented as one in much of the mainstream media. I'll explain this now. So the identity of this party is very ambiguous. For some, it's a party of the radical left. And this is also clearly suggested by the policies that they do have. For others, what's important is that they are sort of non-party party, that they are an alternative, that they are different from the existing parties, that they are something else, right? They are not Microsoft Office, they are something else. So they have appealed to leftist constituencies who would otherwise have voted Indignados or would have stayed at home, but they have also been able to appeal much broader to people who were just fed up with the existing parties and who do not self-identify as on the left. So on one hand, this is a monster of the radical left. They want the Bolivarian revolution to come to Spain. Hugo Chavez in the form of Pablo Iglesias. I'll come to this. On the other hand, we don't know what they want or who they are, which makes them no less of a monster, no less dangerous from the perspective of the established system. So whether defined or undefinable, monstrous they are. As an advisor to the Prime Minister, Rajoy said after the elections, Podemos are freakies. This is a term that he used. They are somehow out there, not to be taken seriously, but at the same time, they're dangerous. They're kind of not us, but they're all the more dangerous for that. We shouldn't let that kind of people into the political system. One thing is to have them in the squares, but having them with seats in the European Parliament and elsewhere, this is dangerous. It's a one-headed monster, though, and the head is Pablo Iglesias, who's I don't think they themselves talk about leaders, but he's the leader. He's young, he's angry, and he's telegenic, and he's been by far the most visible person in the party, to the extent that he has defined the parties to voters who would otherwise not know about the party or not know what they stood for. And this is so to the extent that the joke goes that the name of the party shouldn't be Podemos, which is Spanish for we can, but should be Puedo, which is Spanish for I can. And of course, it's kind of ironic that you have a party that wants to be different from ordinary parties and to eschew traditional forms of representation, and yet everything centers around this guy, Pablo Iglesias, and the people associated with him, a small group of people. Now there's much more to it than this, but first let me note that the fact that the party is defined by its leader, it doesn't take away from its monstrosity in the eyes of the mainstream media and the politicians. It only adds to it, because Podemos now becomes represented as the only thing that's worse than the multitude, namely the multitude led by a populist leader. A populist leader who will lead the multitude who knows where, and a multitude who will sweep their leader with them as it rises up. And the spectre that's haunting in the background here is the spectre of Hugo Chavez, or in the Spanish newspapers and media. One more comment here, especially because it concerns the hegemony versus autonomy debate. The Podemos party is having a constituent assembly in August this year. As with any constituent assembly, they're faced with the problem of how to organize it, how to constitute it as a constituent assembly. Now, 2 weeks ago, this led to heated debates within the party. Because on the one hand, you had those who were active in the assemblies in the so-called circles, and who believed that they should elect representatives to decide on the procedures for, that they should elect the representatives to decide on the procedures for this constituent assembly, for how to go about that. They argued that the leadership around Pablo Iglesias, that the leadership was trying to hijack the party or the movement in an undemocratic way. On the other hand, you had the leadership, the group around Pablo Iglesias, and they argued that the assemblies, they cannot be democratic because not everybody has the time and energy to take part in assemblies. That is why Podemos is not Partido X. And in any case, even if these assemblies should elect representatives, that would reproduce a kind of representational structure that they wanted to eschew. So therefore, for the leadership, it should be decided by an electronic vote on the internet, where everybody had a voice and a vote. Incidentally, this also made the whole process easier to control by the leadership. It should also, they argued, be by closed lists. So you vote for a list rather than for a particular person. And ironically, this is one of the aspects of the current electoral system that has been most criticized by the Indignados, because it creates a kind of endogenous to the political system, to the political parties, which is very problematic. Nonetheless, the leadership got their way, and they got their list of people elected to draw up the procedures for the Constituent Assembly. As Pablo Iglesias said in an interview immediately afterwards, he said, this is a quote, "Anyone taking part in assembly movements, like this one, knows that it's necessary to create structures," end of quote. Right. So this question of representation, it doesn't go away, it persists, and it mutates in different forms as these protests from the squares are moving to different sites, including institutional sites. So, to conclude, the potency of the Indignados is partly a result of their monstrosity, of the fact that they didn't want to and couldn't be captured within existing representational categories. That they are something new arising on the back of a new mode of social production, in Hardenegris terms. Although for some this signaled their impotence, for others, both detractors and supporters, it precisely signaled their power, their potency, a danger to the existing system. A challenge to liberal and non-liberal institutions, whether in the form of new forms of protest, Tunisia, Egypt, Spain, Greece, Occupy, Turkey, Brazil, etc., or in the form of a populism, whether left or right. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Lasse. We have about 20 minutes again for discussion. I don't know who might like to begin. Should we take your question first?
Just going back a little bit to an early point, sort of a general point really, is you said that people felt that the Socialist Party were not for them in their local elections. You know, that they couldn't differentiate them between the Conservative Party. And I just wondered what you thought, how you thought that came about. Why people did not feel that they were any different?
I think it came about in two ways. I mean, it came about over the course of a number of years. So in 2004, people on the left, center-left, they thought of PSOE as something new, as an alternative to the Aznar government, which had come before that. But what happened was what has happened, I think, across Europe and also in North America at least, that these social democratic parties, they have moved towards the right, especially in terms of economic and social policies. So taking on a kind of neoliberal logic that this is the horizon within which we can work, and there's nothing to do about that. So then there's a question of do you raise the unemployment benefits a little bit or more and so on, but nothing more than that. So in terms of the ideological content, the Social Democrats moved right. So that is one thing that happened. The other thing is that people increasingly realized, I mean, that was nothing new, but they increasingly realized that the way that PSOE worked as a party was not really different from PP, the Conservative Party. PSOE is also very hierarchical, closed. That may change now because now they are changing leader and the new people, the young people who are coming in, whoever one of them is elected, that they have a slightly different view of what a party should be like and how it should relate to social movements and so on. It should be more open. So I think it's a combination of the two things of the ideological content. I mean, what's really the difference in economic policies now? But also in terms of, but you have this party which is PSOE, which is equally distant from ordinary people's lives as the Conservatives are, part of the same political class.
Sue?
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah, thanks for an interesting paper. I guess what I was wondering about was, and I understand currently for analytical clarity, you've set up this very clean-cut opposition between hegemony and autonomy. And I'm wondering both in the theoretical frameworks and in the way people articulated their subject relations to the movement, the different movements, if it's as clear as that. And I'm thinking, for instance, which may or may not connect, but MacLeod didn't write in Dissent about populist rupture and the way that oppositional groups would form themselves not as the not A to the A, but a B. So I'm wondering if there's more nuance and maybe points of intersection in those different frameworks rather than clearly you choose from this lot or that lot. And if you could speak to that.
Yes, there's a lot more nuance here. So I use this distinction or this opposition mainly as kind of presentational device to start from. But there's more to be said. I mean, you could say the critique from the autonomy strand of Laclau and Mouffe and also Zizek, but let's focus on Laclau, is that, if you think in terms of hegemony, what you will create is a new hierarchy, new but still a hierarchy, which will take the form of a party and beyond that a state, even if it's an integral state, including a civil society. But that's true, but it's not the whole story about Laclau, because it's not simply about hierarchical relations and about the metaphorical representation of the people by a leader or by a signifier, an empty signifier. It's not that simple, because that kind of representation for Laclau is always interrupted by differences within what is being represented as a whole. So you never have this clear-cut whole. On the other hand, Laclau's critique of Hardt and Negri was initially it was one thing is they don't have a theory of articulation. Okay, so you have these dispersed struggles, which all immediately, they say, like jump to the center of empire, something like that. And also they don't have a theory of subjectivity. Right? How is the subject of the multitude actually created? But then if you look at, and that I think that is true of Empire, of the early Harder Negri. But then if you look at what they're doing, you see in Multitude, and especially in Commonwealth, they start talking about articulation, and they start thinking about this, and they don't shy away from that. They do try to develop some idea of articulation. And later on in the last little book called Declaration, they start talking about subjectivities, and they start from these protests, not only in Spain but Occupy especially, and elsewhere, and they start thinking about, okay, but what kind of subjectivities are actually being created through these protests, to try to think about, but how can we think about the multitude, not simply as the multitude, but as different subjectivities that emerge in different forms at different sites, in relation to and in response to developments or things within Empire. So there's something there. I mean, there's something there that moves Harder Negri more towards Laclau. I mean, then maybe there are still problems with Harder Negri, and obviously there are still differences between them. I'm not saying that, but it's not so straightforward. I mean, and it's not as straightforward as some people within each strand make it to be.
I found particularly interesting the thing that means such as, I don't know, YouTube and Facebook and what have you, are supposed to be outside the political representational system. And by the way, in this way, actually, implicitly, I support your argument, you know, that in the last analysis there is nothing outside. You can ever say you're outside, whether political, because there are two senses in which the word is being used in your paper. I guess there is political representation, there is significatory representation, as in the sense, the signifier is a representation. Okay. So, for one thing, it's interesting that the mainstream discourse assumes that using YouTube or Facebook, somehow you're outside representation, political representation. And on top of that, I found it incredible that what you use to describe both hegemony and the autonomous thing, in fact, and the three possibilities of the Indignados, was a meta language that comes from computers, Microsoft, Linux. So it emerges as if the computer language were a meta language that, you know, above and beyond both political and semantic representation that can be used as the tool to describe everything. I found that amazing.
I don't know what to say. Yes, I'll add one thing, which is I have to say I sometimes find it naive when both theorists like Harder Negri, but also activists, when they speak about these social media and so on, and they think of them as somehow just open and there to be used, just as a kind of open network, which they're clearly not. I mean, sometimes they're talking about really independent social media, which they themselves created, but sometimes they're talking about Facebook and YouTube. But, I mean, these are corporations, right? And well, then you can say, yeah, but it's all part of Empire, and so on. But yes, but I think we need to think about Empire not as a big grey mass, but as differentiated in important ways that need to be taken into account when you think about how you struggle against it. But it is interesting how the kind of metaphors from the world of computers and the internet, how that enters into, how that language and those metaphors, how they enter into to the political language of activists and movements. And these people who are active, they are people for whom these kind of media and and laptops and handheld objects, what else you call it. It's completely natural. This is how they start, which for someone who's a little bit older seems always a little bit strange. We have to try to get used to it.
Okay, so another question here. Are there any other questions that I'm missing as well? Okay, let's do it.
Building on that as well, to start with. First, like obviously, hegemony can work with popular media. I mean, Hitler, for example, would harness the power of radio. So you can so much more than anyone else before. So you can use marketing or new kind of really popular strategies to really press on the most absolutist agendas. That's not something surprising, right? So, then I thought it was very interesting how your actual translation of what you normally call operating systems, but you call it steering system. But I think that is very interesting because that goes back into the old navigation, helmsman metaphor, going back to later. So you have the Kubernetes, the helmsman, right? So from there you have cybernetics, the man who steers. And it's essentially a political metaphor. You know, the head of the state is a helmsman, is the one who steers. And you translated that into steering systems rather than operating systems. And that's great. So I think actually already in your computing metaphor you had politics, right? Which goes back to maritime language. That's it with all that. And then I find it very interesting when we were saying how it makes a huge difference in whose name you're speaking and who is speaking. So at some point you were talking about the perceptions of the left and the right, and to put it in a provocative way, I was just wondering whether, whether in a way that the Indignados movement itself was a social crisis or a crisis of the left. So, I mean, it is a crude way of putting it, but I think this would be a question posed by the right. Like, the right would say that's a crisis of the left, it's not our crisis. But I think it could prove helpful also for the left to ask themselves whether actually, we actually had a huge problem and look what happened.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. But I think it's, you can look at it, and by some it's articulated as a social crisis and as a political crisis in a very general way. Mainly people on the left were articulated in that way, but there's also a very precise sense in which the Indignados movement was a response to a crisis on the left, which goes back to Alistair's question before. I mean, it was a crisis in the sense that there was really no left. Well, there was Izquierda Unida, but they don't have a big place within the political system in Spain. And all you had left was the PSOE, the Social Democrats, but they had kind of abandoned the left, right? So then, how is a progressive or leftist or radical voice? How is that articulated within the political system if those kind of positions don't exist there? Right? So in that way, it's also a crisis of the left, and fortunately, what has happened is that people on the left, including in PSOE, they started asking themselves this kind of question. Maybe there's something wrong in the way that we do politics. But it has mainly been in terms, their self-questioning has mainly been in terms of how do we actually do politics. It hasn't so much been in terms of the content, the ideological content, and we'll see if that changes. I have my doubts. But both in PSOE and also in Izquierda Unida, there has been a kind of self-critical critical self-reflection on the kind of politics, the form that politics should take. But then, yeah. But it's an ongoing discussion within those parties. and we'll see how it goes. In Indignados, which is the party I know the best, it's a discussion between, let's say, young and old, new and old. To a great extent, is a discussion between the Communist Party and those who came out of the Communist Party, and then those who are coming from different, from the ecological movements and so on, who have entered that way into the party, and they have a different kind of background, different way of thinking about politics. And I like your comment about the steering and operating. I guess the question really is, can you have an operating system that's not also a steering system in some way?
Can I just ask a question about your use of the distinctions between the people and the multitude? Because it seems to me in the core of your paper you're identifying yourself quite strongly with the Laclauian hegemonic aspect of position within this discussion, but I'm not sure how the function of the people is operating in terms of when you talk about the constitution of the assembly and the meeting of the Podemos in the summer, and I got the sense in which your reflection was that there was a domestication of that politics. Do you think the Laclauian position can respond to the demands of that politics?
But I think for me the question is whether hegemony necessarily has to take the form that Laclau thinks it takes. He always thought about hegemony on the model of populism, where the people is the central category, and so you have the people versus the system, or this kind of something out there, the antagonistic enemy system in whatever form. But another way of thinking about hegemony would be to go back to the initial formulation of it, where they say in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, they say that, well, actually there are different forms here. Hegemony can take this kind of antagonistic form of the creation of a people, a clear antagonistic frontier, but you also have a kind of hegemony that's more institutional, what they call democratic hegemony, because they come out of the Marxist tradition, where it's more a question of creating relations between different relations that are differential relations, but that are not antagonistic relations between different constituencies or different positions, with a different form of hegemony. And if you try to think about hegemony in that way, in that broader sense, that it can take different forms, then it becomes possible, I think, to think more about the multitude and this kind of protest, but in terms of hegemony. Now then someone might say, yeah, but then hegemony loses a lot of specificity, and that's true, and maybe we could even say, well, let's not call it hegemony, let's just talk about representation more broadly in some sense, or discourse in a way. But I still think it's useful to think about hegemony. Hegemony as articulation in that way.
Any more questions? Okay, well, we're finishing right on time, which is late. We're slightly behind our schedule, but should we take 5 minutes break and thank Lasse for his